From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Hello, everyone, and welcome, and thanks for making it. Is it? Oh, okay. I'm Betsy Peterson, the director of the American Folklife Center here at the Library of Congress, and I want to welcome you to the latest presentation in the Botkin Lecture Series. The Botkin Series allows the American Folklife Center to present the latest scholarship, the best scholarship in the disciplines of folklore, ethnomusicology, oral history, cultural heritage, and other cultural studies. It also allows us the opportunity to enhance our collections. Each of these lectures are videotaped. They do make their way into our archive and eventually make their way up onto our website so that individuals around the world can hear and learn from these lectures, and future generations can hear as well. So if you have a device turned on, a cell phone, et cetera, please turn it off now. And today it is my pleasure to introduce a multi-talented writer, critic, musician, Elijah Wald. Dr. Wald, I should say, is originally from the Boston area, and he began his career as a folk blues guitarist, and he did well, traveling the world and being abroad for roughly a decade, fronting a blues band in Seville, Spain, a swing trio in Antwerp, and a rock band in Colombo, Sri Lanka, before returning to the United States to continue his music here. He's released 2 solo albums, played on as a musician on numerous others, and still remains active as a musician. But as I think many of us know, Elijah has another life, and he is equally well known as a writer, critic, and scholar, and it is in this capacity that he is joining us today. Since the 1980s, Elijah has gained wide renown as a writer on roots and world music, and he's written for numerous newspapers and magazines, most notably the Boston Globe, where he published over 1,000 articles until he left the paper in 2000. He has also authored more than a dozen influential books, and I'll just name a couple here: Escaping the Delta, Robert Johnson and the Invention of the Blues, How the Beatles Destroyed Rock and Roll, an alternative history of American popular music, and Narco Corrido, a journey into the music of drugs, guns, and guerrillas. The Mayor of MacDougall Street is a memoir that he co-authored with Dave Van Ronk, and it served as the inspiration for the Coen Brothers movie Inside Llewyn Davis. And I must say it's better than the movie. He has won a Grammy Award for the album notes to the Arhoolie Records 40th anniversary box set, for which he was also nominated as a producer. His other awards include an ASCAP Deems Taylor Award and an honorable mention for the American Musicological Society's Otto Kinkleday Award. My apologies. Elijah also holds an interdisciplinary PhD in ethnomusicology and sociolinguistics, which I think is a fairly recent degree. Okay, congratulations. And he has also taught for several years in the musicology department at UCLA. So, without further ado, we're delighted to have Elijah Wald with us today, and please join me in welcoming Elijah. I should also say Elijah will talk for roughly an hour. We'll have some questions, and that will be followed by a book signing out in the lobby, and we please hope you will go out and buy one of the books. So take it away.
Okay, I will take it as far as I can. Okay. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about Dylan, but I'm also more generally talking a bit about how we do history. And want to start out by saying what historians do is we tell stories. For those of you who speak French or Spanish, it's in fact the same word. Histoire is history or story. And I think that's an important point to make, because history is not what happened in the past. History is the process of organizing what we know about the past into stories that are relevant to us in the present. And what that means is that history is not static. It's constantly changing because what's relevant to us in the present is changing. And the Dylan story, we all know the standard Dylan story, I suspect, in this room. The standard story is he came to New York as a folk singer in very much Woody Guthrie's tradition. He became the new young voice of the folk protest movement. He then switched to writing more poetic, introspective lyrics, which irritated a lot of the people who'd loved him as a folk protest singer. And then at Newport in 1965, he declared his independence from the folk scene, and the boring old folkies didn't understand and booed him. But he was an artist and went his own way, and history has proved him right. Now, I don't disagree with any of that, but it is history as it was written in a particular moment in the second half of the 1960s, as part of announcing the arrival of rock and roll as a mature, serious art form. And in that history, which has remained the standard Dylan history, he is first and foremost a songwriter, and indeed a poet. But what I'm going to be talking about today is sort of a different story, because I was on a different mission. My question was about Dylan's choice to go electric at Newport. And that's not a decision made as a songwriter. That's a decision made as a musician and performer. And once I started thinking about, okay, let's get away from the songwriting and discuss who Dylan was as a musician and performer, I was immediately struck by a sort of bizarre fact in the Dylan story, which is the way everyone talked about Dylan when he first became known is, well, he's not a great singer, he's not a great guitar player, but he's such an incredible writer that it surmounts all of these weaknesses. But in 1961, Dylan became the first young male folk singer in Greenwich Village to ever get a profile in the New York Times or to be ever signed by a major record label. And at that point, he'd only written 2 songs, neither of which was particularly interesting, and was signed and written up as a musician and performer, not as a songwriter. So if his strength was as a songwriter and he was deficient as a musician, how'd that happen? And also, the way we all hear the story is at that point, he was a Woody Guthrie clone, but the New York Times story doesn't mention Woody Guthrie. It compares him to Blind Lemon Jefferson, the Texas blues musician from the 1920s. Now, if that was right, then the story of Dylan deciding in 1965 to go electric with the Paul Butterfield Blues Band sounds like a completely different story. If we've got somebody who in 1961 was a Blind Lemon Jefferson-style blues singer, and now he's teaming up with the Butterfield Band. Now, it's not quite that simple, but, sorry, that wasn't supposed to happen, but it did. In any case, this is Dylan with his original band, the Golden Chords. You will notice the ad of Monty Erickson, Leroy Huckerla, and Bobby Zimmerman. And what he sounded like at that point was this. Oh, we need that to be much, much louder. His main instrument at that point was piano rather than guitar, and he was planning to be Little Richard. And the next thing, in fact, that happens on that tape is an argument between him and one of his friends, because the friend is saying nice things about Elvis Presley, and Dylan is saying, no, you have to listen to the real guys who Elvis Presley imitated, and Clyde McPhatter and Ray Charles and the Drifters. In fact, we can do the picture. Yes, the real guys and the fake guys. You will notice that there is a difference between the real guys and the fake guys. Like many teenagers, young Bobby Zimmerman was trying to define himself. And that concept of authenticity, which regularly comes in the Dylan at Newport story, I'm just trying to make the point, he was in that concept already at this point, but in a different world. And that whole idea of authenticity, what that's about is there are few of us who know the real stuff, unlike that mass of stupid people out there who don't. And that's really the entire discourse of authenticity. You can phrase it all sorts of other ways, but that's basically what it's about. Dylan grew up in northern Minnesota in a town with not a single African-American resident. I have checked the census. And he discovered this secret world of music that he could access on the radio late at night coming out of Shreveport, Louisiana. And knowing about that music set him apart. And when he met anyone else who knew about that music, it was sort of like they were members of a secret club. Now, that's not a new idea. It's one of the stock cliches of rock history, that there was this secret world that young, specifically white, specifically usually male, listeners were discovering late night on the radio, and that changed America. That cliche typically connects this rebel music with other rebel elements of that period, and Dylan fits that discourse perfectly. By the time I was a teenager learning about all of this, that rock and roll, James Dean rebel attitude was also often being linked to the alienation of Jack Kerouac and the Beats. But that's an anachronism. That link happened after Dylan. And Kerouac and the Beats were not into rock and roll. They came up in the 1940s listening to modern jazz and classical music. Kerouac's writing is full of references to Brahms, Beethoven, Shostakovich, Stravinsky. That is, they were rebels, but they were grown-ups, and they listened to grown-up music. And in the 50s and early 60s, rock and roll was not grown-up music. If you were in favor of it, you were saying it was fun, it was exciting, it was energetic, but it was music for kids and poor uneducated people. Even people who liked rock took it for granted. This is one of the fascinating things you find reading interviews in this period. Took it for granted that if they went to college, they would start listening to more mature kinds of music. And classical and jazz were the most familiar, and by the late 50s, folk music had joined them. And indeed, by 1960, when Dylan moved to Minneapolis and started at the university there, folk music had become the defining collegiate style, thanks to the Kingston Trio and the dozens of groups that followed in their wake. Now, it may sound a little strange for me to talk about modern jazz and folk music overlapping, but that, in fact, was a reality. I mean, a typical record collection that had the Kingston Trio would also have Dave Brubeck and very likely Miles Davis. And in fact, one of the interesting facts of American music history is that the Kingston Trio actually made their East Coast debut in New York and the Village Vanguard on a double bill with Thelonious Monk. They did 2 weeks as a double bill. That is, the Kingston Trio were fun, but they were the fun music that the smart kids listened to. And the Newport Folk Festival fits perfectly in this. It was an offshoot of the Newport Jazz Festival. It was, in fact, originally planned as an afternoon at the Newport Jazz Festival and then sort of became its own festival. So when Dylan went off to college, he was following an absolutely normal transition going into folk music. But as somebody who had been an R&B purist who didn't like white rock and roll, it's interesting to notice that if you read Dylan's description of this period, the artists who first got him into folk music is this list. And if you look at his repertoire, that's who he's singing. He's singing Odetta and Leon Bibb, principally. And it may just be coincidental, but in that context, it's sort of interesting that the first Woody Guthrie album he mentions ever having, this was the cover. I don't want to make too much of that, but it's interesting. Now, when he discovered Woody Guthrie and Ramblin' Jack Elliott, he did change his style profoundly, and he got very much into sounding like that. But again, this story has often been told in a particular way, with him becoming the next songwriter after Woody. So I'd want to point out that this record, which was the first Woody Guthrie record he had, and which in the Minneapolis crowd was described as Woody Guthrie's greatest work, has only one original song on it. Woody Guthrie was being heard in this world as an authentic folk voice singing old folk songs. Likewise, Jack Elliott normally comes into this story as a link to Woody Guthrie, but Jack Elliott sang a lot of other stuff, and the stuff that you most profoundly hear Jack's influence on Dylan is stuff like this. No, that's not the track. Sorry, that was that. Here we go.
I got the blues from Mobile and everybody San Francisco Bay. Ocean gone so far away. Didn't mean to treat you so bad. But scaling in his head. Make me cry like to make me die. Wanna lay down and die.
That's actually Dylan, but it might as well be Ramblin' Jack. It's so close. And that's what Dylan sounded like when he arrived in Greenwich Village. That song is by Jesse Fuller, a black blues performer, but virtually everyone on the folk scene at that period got it through Jack Elliott. And Dylan came to New York to visit Woody Guthrie, who by then was his hero. Again, this is a story that's a little more complicated than it's normally told, because his huge devotion to Woody Guthrie, the music was part of it, but a huge part of it was having read Bound for Glory. And I can speak for myself on this one. For an awful lot of us, Woody Guthrie, more than anything else, was the character Woody Guthrie created for himself in Bound for Glory. And Dylan showed up in Greenwich Village playing blues, playing some of Woody's songs, but profoundly he showed up being Woody Guthrie. He showed up as an orphan from the Western Plains who had left home when he was 13 and bummed around the country playing in carnivals and burlesque houses and bars, and had picked up his music from people he'd met along the way. The character in Bound for Glory, as he put it in his first interview, I sing old jazz songs, sentimental cowboy songs, top 40 hit parade stuff. People have to name it something, so they call it folk music. And that's a really interesting statement, because he's already, at that moment in 1960, setting himself apart from the young urban kids on the folk scene who are trying to sing this music of the folk. He's being a folk who sings all kinds of music. And that's something I had completely misunderstood. Or rather, it's something I never paid attention to because I'd already absorbed the idea of him as part of this world of the urban people who were playing the folk music. And what changed my whole picture of who Dylan was talking to Peter Stamfel. I don't know how many of you know this name. He is a crazed, druggy, brilliant, wonderful human being who had a band called the Holy Modal Rounders and later the Fugs. And he and Dylan and Jim Kweskin actually worked some as a trio back in that first year. And when I asked him about when he first saw Dylan, he said it changed his life because Dylan was playing hillbilly music like it was rock and roll. And Peter had always thought that the two great loves of his life, rock and roll and hillbilly music, were completely separate worlds, and here was somebody proving that they could be the same thing. When I heard that, it made no sense whatsoever to me. I had heard early Dylan. It didn't sound at all like rock and roll. But Peter is a genius. So Dave Van Ronk, my mentor, famously said, Peter Stampfel is undoubtedly some kind of genius, just nobody has yet figured out what kind. Which is true. But anyway, so I went home and grabbed Dylan's first album and decided to listen through, and God damn it, there it was. Some of the younger people in the room may not instantly recognize that riff. That's from the biggest hit of 1958. Which Dylan has repurposed.
Highway 51 runs right by my baby's door.
So I thought, damn, I've made a discovery. Then I read the liner notes. They say the diesel-tempoed Highway 51 is of a type sung by the Everly Brothers. I read the rest of the liner notes. They list Dylan's influences as Woody Guthrie, Hank Williams, Jelly Roll Morton, Carl Perkins, and early Elvis Presley. Now, I've owned that album for over 40 years. I never noticed that. I've read those liner notes over and over, so why didn't I notice that? The answer was because I knew when I first got that Dylan album that he was a folkie in a scene that hated rock and roll and hated Elvis Presley. So I simply glossed over that as I read it over and over. But what if that wasn't true? What if Columbia Records and Bob Dylan were listing his links to Elvis Presley on that first album? Because that, in fact, was something that would make him more appealing. That doesn't fit the standard Dylan story at all. And it sounds crazy to all of us who heard this first album as the precursor to freewheeling and the times they are a-changing. But now I'd like to do a little questioning. How many of you own Dylan's first album, this album? Okay, keep your hands up for a second. How many of you was that the first Dylan album you had? There you go. Yeah. Virtually all the hands went down. We all went back to this album after we already had heard the Dylan of the times they are changing and freewheeling. And so we had this story that he'd done that and then he did freewheeling and this was Dylan. But in fact, freewheeling wasn't the next thing that Dylan did after this album. The next thing Dylan did after this album in January of 1962 was this.
I got mixed up confusion, man, it's a killing me.
Stop that. Go away.
And they're all too hard to please.
Okay, so if Dylan sounded like that in 1962, why the hell was it news that he went electric in 1965? The answer is nobody heard that single. And in fact, nobody listened to Dylan's first album. The way everybody discovered Dylan was this record. Nope, not that record. Go away. What the hell is that? That was really weird. This record.
How many roads must a man walk down before they call him a man? How many seas must a white dove sail before?
That was how virtually everybody discovered Bob Dylan. And by the time we heard him, we already knew he played that kind of music. He had a lousy voice compared to Peter, Paul, and Mary, but it was that kind of stuff. It was called folk music, but it didn't sound a lot like Woody Guthrie or Ramblin' Jack Elliott or Dave Van Ronk or Blind Lemon Jefferson or God knows Elvis Presley. What it sounded like was a record that had been the #1 hit a dozen years earlier, of 1950. A record that sounded like this. Let's see if this time it sounds less squeaky. So that's the huge hit of 1950, and that's the Weavers, and the guy sitting on the floor playing a banjo is Pete Seeger. Now, we tend to hear Seeger's story told in a particular way as well. He was a political folk singer, a friend of Woody Guthrie. Together they formed a political folk singing group in the early 1940s called the Almanac Singers. Then in 1950 he formed the Weavers. They were blacklisted. He bravely stood up to HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee, and by the 1960s, he was the grand old man of the folk scene. In the Dylan story, he's the guy who tried to grab an axe and cut the cable when Dylan went electric at Newport. So it's a bit surprising to hear that lush pop orchestration on Goodnight Irene, which many of us had forgotten existed, and to introduce Pete Seeger as somebody who got #1 hits and founded the pop folk style. But Pete Seeger was a complicated guy. In 1950, when that record hit, he was 31 years old and still virtually unknown, except to folk music and folk dance fans around Greenwich Village. In fact, the year that he hit with the Weavers was also the year that his first ever solo album appeared. It was this record. And this record is extremely important historically, though it has largely been forgotten. This was the first time ever that an urban educated musician attempted to present folk songs the way they were actually played in rural communities. Up until this time, all the people popularizing folk music for urban audiences had been changing it, adapting it to fit the habits of people who were used to listening to classical and pop music. And very much the way the Weavers approached, the Joan Baez approach, the Peter, Paul, and Mary approach. But Pete had written and self-published an instructional book on how to play Southern Mountain banjo styles. And his solo album was a showcase for his belief that traditional rural music was not just raw material that you could take and turn into concert music, but in fact was a fully achieved art created by important and often virtuosic artists. And that sounded very, very different from the smooth harmonies of the Weavers. The way this record sounded was like this.
I was born and raised in East Virginia, North Carolina, I did go.
And this set off a revolution. A whole generation of young players, Tom Paley notably among them, the New Lost City Ramblers, Dave Van Ronk, who dubbed this group the Neo-Ethnics, started trying to play this music authentically, not like Burl Ives or Richard Dyer Bennett or Susan Reed, but the way people actually played it down south where it came from. And Pete very much was a hero for this world, and he very much fitted that. He was a man who had just built his own log cabin house, cutting down the trees on his own land. He was very much trying to sort of live this in a lot of different ways. And for him, that was very much connected to his politics, to populism, communism, democracy. the idea that folk artists were not primitives. They were just as important, intelligent, mature, valuable, virtuosic as concert artists. I cut a moment out of this talk, and I just want to see where I end up next. Okay, now I know. Yeah. And the thing is, the way Pete Seeger first heard folk music was his father took him down to the Asheville Folk Festival. And he was in love with the music, but also he was entranced by the way the music seemed to fit into the community and to seem to represent the lives of the people who was making it. And he had this idea of this music as being inseparable from the community. And one of his great missions was to encourage people to make their own music in their own communities, rather than just consuming music made by professionals, including professionals who might be marketed as folk singers. And that's one of the things that's really easy to misunderstand about Pete Seeger, that for him, a bunch of people getting together to play string quartets or to sing doo-wop was as much or more his mission than people going and sitting in a concert watching someone on stage singing Barbara Allen. Anyway, this brings us to the Newport Folk Festival. The first two Newport Folk Festivals in 1959 and 1960 were basically just big concerts. They were like the Newport Jazz Festival. They were mostly made up of professional performers from the New York area. But in 1960, Pete Seeger did something interesting. He requested George Wein, the producer of the festivals, to not pay him and to use the money saved by not paying him to bring down Jean Carignan, a French-Canadian fiddler. And driving back from that festival, Toshi Seeger, Pete's wife, had the idea, what could you do if you could persuade all the stars to do that? And in 1963, they sat down with George Wein and designed a festival on that principle. The idea of the Newport Folk Festivals from 63 on was everybody got $50, known or unknown. And because they had some heavyweights like Pete Seeger behind it, people like Pete Seeger, Joan Baez, the Tarriers, Theodore Bickel, Peter, Paul, and Mary agreed to work for $50 a day, which meant that there was all the extra money you could use to bring in unknown performers, like Doc Watson, Mississippi John Hurt. Neither of those names anybody knew until they appeared at Newport in 1963. Bill Monroe and John Lee Hooker, who were known within their own communities but had never been presented to folk music audiences. The first Cajun band ever presented outside rural Louisiana. This all happened at Newport in 63. And also some unknown new young faces like Judy Collins and Tom Paxton and Bob Dylan. And there was some explicitly political singers who were at Newport, but again, this is something that I misunderstood, because one of the other things Pete Seeger did in this period, he co-founded a newsletter called Broadside Magazine in New York, and a lot of young songwriters, including Bob Dylan, started writing a lot of political songs to get published in Broadside. And because histories of the folk scene tend to be very New York-centric and to a degree Dylan-centric, when we talk about protest music in the 60s, there's a tendency to immediately think of Bob Dylan and Phil Oakes and Tom Paxton. But in Pete Seeger's mind, when he wanted to bring protest music to Newport in 1963, that was not what he was thinking about. This is Pete Seeger doing the introduction at Newport in 63 to the political group.
I often think, it's easy for a person living up in safety to sing about freedom. But to really know how to sing those songs, maybe you'd have to face the dogs, face the hoses and the water, and go to jail, as these four young people have gone to jail not once or twice, but some of them as many as a dozen or 24 times during the past 2 years, in trying to make our country a more democratic country. Here they are, the freedom singers from all over Georgia.
And the iconic moment of that festival was the grand finale on Friday night. And that's a picture that it's easy to misread in retrospect. But what that picture is you have the young stars of the folk scene over here, Peter, Paul, and Mary, and Joan Baez. And the grand old men of the folk scene over on the other side, Pete Seeger and Theodore Bickel, fresh off starring in the Broadway run of The Sound of Music. And in the middle, you have the unknown young figures representing the voice of young America, Bob Dylan and the Freedom Singers. And they're linking arms and singing Blowing in the Wind and We Shall Overcome. And that was the image of protest at that moment. The big issue of 1963 was civil rights, and when Dylan became associated with protest songs, that was the association. He had written Blowing in the Wind, which was heard by a lot of people up north as an anthem of the civil rights movement. And a month later, in August 1963, he and Joan Baez appeared at the March on Washington with Martin Luther King. Now, my time's limited, so I'm going to now make a lateral jump across the Atlantic to England. In England, the world had looked very different in the 1950s and into the early 60s. England was still recovering from World War II. World War II had been great for the United States. The US had come out the strongest, richest, healthiest country in the world. England had been bombed to smithereens. It was dark, it was cold, it was miserable, there was no work, everything was rationed. And the United States looked very bright and exciting and fun. Hollywood movies, the music, all of that. And it was this huge romantic attraction to everything American for young people in England. And one result of that was they weren't drawing all the lines between different kinds of American culture that we drew over here. So, for example, the banjo player of Ken Collier's New Orleans jazz band, a guy named Lonnie Donegan, was on the breaks playing Woody Guthrie songs. This was not something that happened at jazz concerts in the United States. But weirdly enough, he proceeded to get a hit with Leadbelly's Rock Island Line that also went top 10 over here and started a whole style of music called skiffle. And a whole generation of young Englishmen started playing skiffle music, and that included teenagers who a few years later were forming groups like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and Led Zeppelin. There's a wonderful YouTube video of Jimmy Page at age 14 with his skiffle group explaining to the interviewer that he wants to grow up to do biomedical research. I really recommend this. And they were playing American hillbilly and blues songs and listening to Ramblin' Jack Elliott and Woody Guthrie and the Memphis Jug Band if they could get it, but also to the electric blues of Muddy Waters. Chris Barber, the trombone player in Ken Collier's band. Oh, I see, you can't see Lonnie Donegan. He's not worth seeing anyway. Ken Collier brought Muddy Waters Electric Band over to England and had them on double bills with his New Orleans traditional jazz group. And Chuck Berry started coming over to them as Chess Records music. I mean, the Rolling Stones thought of Chuck Berry and Muddy Waters as the same thing. It's that Chess record thing. Over here, that was not the same thing. And by 1963, they were listening to Bob Dylan. And then this came back across the Atlantic. And suddenly the number one hit in the United States is the Animals doing House of the Rising Sun, which they've learned off Bob Dylan's first record, which no one over here had paid any attention to. And we call this the British invasion. There are all these British rockers who are superstars, and they worship Bob Dylan. The Beatles, this was in Melody Maker. It's Britain's most popular music newspaper. And the whole interview, they're saying, yeah, we really think we need to sound more like Bob Dylan and be more like Bob Dylan. We love his attitude. He doesn't seem to care about anything, and he just goes his own way. And British bands were also cutting electric versions of Dylan hits. This one is one of the less familiar and more wonderful ones. It's with Jimmy Page on guitar by a group called the Fairies.
sitting with a new wife. Heaven, you don't know by now. It don't use to sitting with a new wife. It don't ever do somehow.
Now, 64. Now that singing style makes an other interesting link, because another huge hit over here in 1964, I've never seen, even on the internet, they don't connect this to Don't Think Twice, It's All Right, which is really weird, because listen to it.
Don't call my name out your window when I'm leaving. I won't even turn my head. Don't send your kin folks to give me no talking. I'll be gone, like I said. You'd say the same old thing that you've been saying all along. Lay there in your bed, keep your mouth shut till I'm gone. Don't give me that old familiar cry and cuss and moan. Understand, you man.
Next to Ring of Fire, that was Johnny Cash's biggest hit of the 1960s, and it's just Don't Think Twice, It's All Right. So you can see how at this point Bob Dylan might be thinking there was space for him on the top 40. Which brings us to the 1965 Newport Folk Festival. No, it doesn't. It brings us to his next album where he goes electric, excuse me, bringing it all back home. 1965, he brings out this album with the cover photo of him looking hip, rich, and intense, and electric instrumentation on one side. And that album title was framed explicitly by Columbia Records as Dylan as the answer to the British invasion. They've been doing American music and been selling it to us, but we've got the real thing, and Dylan's bringing it all back home. That brings us to the Newport Folk Festival, where once again the bill included Pete Seeger, Joan Baez, Dylan, Peter, Paul and Mary, the Freedom Singers, Mississippi John Hurt, Doc Watson, Bill Monroe, a lot of familiar faces, a lot of people coming back to spend a sunny weekend listening to the music they loved, surrounded by other people who shared their tastes and beliefs. But during that first evening's concert, they got something very different than what they'd been used to at Newport. Sounded like this. How do you think the folkies reacted to that one? Alan Lomax, the conservative dean of hardcore American folklorist, jumped on stage as soon as the Chambers Brothers finished playing, seized the mic, and said, "I'm very proud tonight that we finally got onto the Newport Folk Festival stage our modern American folk music, rock and roll." Okay, so how does that square with our picture of Alan Lomax, the guy who hated electric music in general and rock and roll in particular? Well, the answer is that's simply flat out wrong. Alan Lomax in 1959 at Carnegie Hall presented Muddy Waters with electric backing and a doo-wop group. He wanted the Cadillacs, the guys who did Speedo, but they didn't show up, so he got a less-known group. And he took great pride in how horrified a lot of the folk fans were by this, but his whole point, which he'd been arguing for years, is real folk music in New York is what black kids are doing in Harlem, not a bunch of college kids with banjos trying to pretend they're hillbillies in Washington Square Park. That's why he objected to the Butterfield Blues Band, who he famously objected to at Newport. He was the guy who had discovered muddy waters in Mississippi. He knew real Chicago blues. He appreciated real Chicago blues. And the first real Chicago blues band to be brought to Newport was a bunch of white college kids. That was his problem with the Butterfield Band. Now, personally, I love the Butterfield Band, and I want to underline a point here, which is one of the big problems with the way music history is often done is that people confuse music history with music criticism and write about what's good. I often make the joke that if we did political history the way we do music history, we would do histories of the 20th century and leave out Hitler because we don't like his work. The thing is, criticism is about establishing what has value in the present for us. History is about trying to understand how other people thought and felt and heard things and felt about things in other times and situations. They're the opposite exercise. And the way rock history tended to be done was established with the first rock histories in the late 60s and early 70s, and it was establishing rock as a serious, mature art form. And Exhibit A was Bob Dylan and the Beatles. And those names have forever since ritually been put together as creating this new music that is maybe called rock instead of rock and roll in the second half of the 60s. And in that framing, Newport is a confrontation between the young, exciting present, represented by Bob Dylan, and the old conservative, purist folkies, represented by Lomax and Seeger. And in here, Dylan is Dylan, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones. But let's take another look at that album cover. Dylan looks very different from the scruffy hobo kid we remember from the earlier 60s. He's long-haired, fashionable, a pop star in a rich environment. It fits perfectly in the Stones-Beatles narrative. But those records that he has carefully strewn next to him tell a slightly different story. Erich von Schmidt, who was a mentor and model for him on the early Cambridge, Massachusetts folk blues scene, Lotte Lenya singing the Berlin cabaret music of Kurt Weill and Bertolt Brecht, which he had gotten into through his girlfriend Susie Rotolo in the early 1960s in the Village. Robert Johnson, king of the Delta blues singers, which he had gotten into at the moment he was first signed to Columbia Records. The one modern record is not the Beatles or the Stones, it's the Impressions' Keep On Pushin', which incidentally not only had been a top 10 hit that year, but was one of the songs the Chambers Brothers played in their set at Newport. So you never find histories of the folk scene melding with the rock scene in this thing we called folk rock. They don't tend to bring the Impressions into that story because the Impressions are in this separate world that we call soul music. As it happens, Curtis Mayfield was known for writing socially conscious songs, but he's just not typically in that narrative. But for Dylan himself, obviously, the lines were being drawn a little differently. And apparently he wasn't alone. I'm going to play you something from Joan Baez from Newport that same year. She was on the same night as the Chambers Brothers. And one of the interesting things about that weekend in 1965 is that the weekend of the Newport Folk Festival was also the weekend that Lyndon Johnson announced that he was doubling the draft and firmly committing the United States to a ground war in Southeast Asia. Virtually nobody at Newport that weekend responded to that, the one exception being Joan Baez, who was probably the most political person on that scene. This is how she responded.
Dedication to President Johnson on his marvelous foreign policy.
Okay. Nothing I had ever read in the histories of folk, rock, soul, or pop prepared me to find Joan Baez making her strongest political statement of the 1965 Newport Folk Festival by covering a recent hit by the Supremes. But there it is. So why were people so upset when Dylan played an electric set on Sunday night? They've had the Chambers Brothers, they've had Joan Baez covering the Supremes, they've had the Butterfield Blues Band. The usual answer is they were a lot of purist folkies who'd come to hold hands and sing Kumbaya, and they didn't get it. That however much they supported left-wing causes, they were social conservatives, and he was a brave rebel. There's some truth to that. Just as there's some truth to the alternate story that they were young leftists fighting against racism, the war machine, and the deadening mindlessness of mass commercial culture, and Dylan had gone off on a star trip and was trying to become a hit maker. But, you know, the easy way out is to say that the people who booed him were just stupid or out of touch. But the fact is there were lots of smart, aware people who were unhappy with his set that night, and that's why the booing mattered. One of the reasons is a lot of them were already upset before he got on stage. Remember, the founding idea of Newport was that the stars were just there to bring in the audience, who were then going to discover the real folk artists. There were these huge evening concerts that typically had 17,000 people, but the meat of the festival were the daytime workshops, all these little stages which normally just had 200 to 500 people. You could sit up close, you could be right at the feet of Mississippi John Hurt or Doc Watson. But by 1965, I should say also, you know, people like Joan Baez and Pete Seeger played along with this. I mean, Joan Baez would show up at the ballad workshop, and she'd show up at the kids' songs workshop, and Pete Seeger would be on the banjo workshop, and they'd be there framing, you know, you like me, listen to Almeda Riddle, listen to Frank Prophet. Dylan was an exception. By 1965, he was not only getting pop hits, not only was like a Rolling Stone on the radio, but he was acting like a star. And when he showed up at Newport, he was mobbed everywhere he went. And when he played on an afternoon workshop on Saturday afternoon, 5,000 people showed up. And they were complaining because, like, they could hear the banjo workshop, the people at the back better than they could hear Dylan. And a lot of people at Newport felt that the festival was being ruined by all these stupid pop fans who had crowded the place to hear the latest hit record star from the radio, and that these people didn't belong at their festival. And that went along with other concerns about how their world was changing. Our whole idea of the 60s, the hippies, long hair, drugs, rock and roll, the Vietnam War, that's all after 1965. The world shifts in this moment. And, I mean, if you look at photos of Martin Luther King's March on Washington in '63, it's a protest march, and everyone's in suits and ties. That would have been unimaginable 3 years later. The Vietnam War was just beginning in '65. The civil rights movement had been based on this idea of everybody linking arms, black and white, old and young, marching together. The iconic picture from 1963. 1964, it had reached its high point in the Freedom Summer with a lot of people from up north going down south to Mississippi to work on voter registration. 1965, the ghettos were exploding. SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which had organized the Freedom Summer, was kicking out its white members. The new word was Black Power. A lot of people had been killed. Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney, Medgar Evers, most recently Malcolm X. It was a frightening, scary, difficult moment. And a lot of people had come to Newport that weekend, hoping to recharge their batteries, to be surrounded by other people who shared their beliefs, get ready to deal with what they were going to have to deal with out there in the world, and to link arms and sing "We Shall Overcome." And instead, Dylan was on stage, alone, in the spotlight, blasting the loudest music they've ever heard in their lives, and singing, "How does it feel to be on your own?" And the answer was, for a lot of people, it felt absolutely horrible. But for most of them, that was a relatively momentary reaction. It's important to say, I've titled this talk Music, Myth, and History, and I want to emphasize the importance of myths. They're not the same thing as history, but they are part of history, and at least equally important. And I would say that the myths surrounding Dylan at Newport are at least as important as what he actually did that night. What he did that night was not a big surprise. Everybody'd heard Like a Rolling Stone. It was a top 40 record right then. What was startling was not that he was on stage playing Like a Rolling Stone. What was startling and what made news, in fact, when he played on Saturday afternoon, most of the requests you can hear on the tape are people yelling for him to do Like a Rolling Stone. What made it news was that he got booed. The way rock historians have tended to describe that is with an analogy to Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, getting booed in Paris in 1913. Now, there are lots of problems with that analogy, but it's central to the shift from rock and roll being dumb teenage music to rock and roll being serious art. And the fact that Dylan got booed and continued to pursue that direction, as he was booed from concert to Australia to Britain, and stuck to his guns, proved that he wasn't selling out to the pop machine, that he was a serious artist who was going his own way, whatever his fans wanted. And that changed the whole perception of what rock could be. One way to phrase that shift is that the historians have tended to describe that night as Dylan's break with the folk scene. He took the folk scene with him. Not just all those people at Newport who were booing that week, but 2 months later loved the stuff once they'd had time to assimilate it, but also the folk scene's seriousness, its commitment to ideals of authenticity, its sense of importance and social relevance. All that got transferred onto rock. And to a great extent, that's the process by which rock became and has forever since been grown-up music and college kid music. Again, that's not a critical judgment, positive or negative. That's a historical judgment, which is to say it's an attempt to understand and explain why certain people felt the way they felt, thought the way they thought, and acted the way they acted in a particular moment. And I'm just going to finish by saying we're in a particularly bizarre election year. And one of the exercises that I see very little of, even from some people I like a lot, is the exercise of trying to understand why intelligent, grown-up people might be doing something that to you seems crazy. And I think the value of studying history is that you learn that intelligent grown-up people over the years have constantly made choices that to you in retrospect seem crazy. But if you study history seriously, you begin to understand how, had you been there, you might have made those crazy choices yourself. And I feel like if I've done my book on Dylan at Newport right, people who weren't there reading it won't know whether they would have been among the people booing or cheering, because God damn it, it's complicated. And I think that that's what the value of the study of history is. And with that, thank you very much. And now I'm happy to take questions, comments. Yes?
Yeah, I know this talk was scheduled before the recent sale of all of Dylan's archives to the University of Tulsa. Were you following that, or have you followed it since it was announced?
You know, the simple answer is I've done my damn Dylan book, and I don't want to think about him for a couple of years.
Well, it's going to be a great source of
It-
material, yeah.
Absolutely. No. I mean, I clearly had the times been reversed, I would have had to make a trip to Tulsa, which would probably have been good for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It seems to me that another main reason for what he did at this time was to dissociate himself from the political world surrounding folk music, which of course at that time, and very much to the left, I don't think it was ever that political to begin with. I mean, you talk to, you read people's comments about what he really thought at that time in the early 60s. He had a profound empathy and sympathy for poor black people, that is true.
And poor white people.
Yeah, that's true. But other than that, he was not an ideologue. And I think, and he never wanted to be any kind of voice of a generation, a leader of a generation. And they were sort of, the folk movement was trying to seem to elevate him to this kind of, spokesman. And I think he rebelled against that. He's a very private person.
All of that's true. I would have said that rebellion had happened considerably earlier.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, already when he was doing acoustic stuff, he had moved away from the political stuff and the folk movement. I mean, there's this wonderful quote that I actually used to begin one of my chapters that he, God bless him, scrawled on the back of the original manuscript of It Ain't Me, Babe, which he wrote in a London hotel. And on the back he writes, how many times am I going to have to say I'm not a folk singer before people will stop saying he's not a folk singer? It ain't me, babe. No. Clearly that had been happening, and that was part of what was going on. But the rock and roll thing, I don't think he went into rock and roll to separate himself from the folk world. He went into rock and roll because who the hell wouldn't if they could? I mean, it's fun.
Oh, I agree.
I think if he could have been a rock star in 1960, he would have been a rock star in 1960. But the path was not there, and when the path opened up, he followed it. It's fun. Yeah.
Hi, Ken Roseman. Hello, Facebook friend. I'm a music journalist. I live around here. I'm a big fan of English folk rock. So when you said the word England, my ears perked up. But of course, Fairport and Still I Span weren't happening in 1963. And I've always wondered about how the influences really went back and forth across the ocean.
Constantly. Yeah. No, look, I think one of the horrible problems with the way we do music history is that there's a tendency to act as if genres have meaning. There's no such thing as folk rock. This is just a marketing term. It's a way of selling records. It has nothing to do with how anything sounds. I sometimes do the exercise of playing Maggie's Farm the way Dylan did it at Newport next to what we call folk rock. Maggie's Farm sounds like Satisfaction more than it sounds like Sounds of Silence. And the Rolling Stones were, in fact, imitating. Satisfaction, listen to it. It's a flat-out Dylan imitation. And Mick Jagger was very upfront about that. There's this wonderful quote from Jagger talking about Keith Richards running into Bob Dylan in New York right around then. And Dylan saying to him, I could have written Satisfaction, but you couldn't have written Mr. Tambourine Man. And the interviewer says, well, what did he mean by that? It wasn't a put down, was it? And Jagger says, well, yes, of course it was. But it's funny. He's like, it's true. And it is true. Of course Dylan could have written that. And the Stones were in full-scale Dylan imitation mode that summer. There's Satisfaction, 19th Nervous Breakdown, Get Off My Cloud. It's all Dylan imitations. And yet you read the histories and Dylan is part of folk rock and the Stones are over in blues rock. This is crap. Yes, Body and Soul is an English song. Limehouse Blues is an English song. Musicians had been trading music and styles and trends back and forth across the Atlantic, back at least to the minstrel shows, and probably earlier, and it kept happening in the 60s and 70s and 80s and is happening right now. And I just think it's completely unuseful to sort of divide these things into genres. People, particularly people who want to get on the pop charts, are constantly listening to each other.
And
Hey, suddenly 3 hands up from women. Age before beauty. Yes.
Thank you. I enjoyed your talk tremendously. The historical perspective was fascinating to me. I grew up in a house with original records by the Almanac Singers.
Mm-hmm. Me
And
too.
my question to you is, did you interview any of the people you mentioned personally?
For this project, most of the people of that generation were unfortunately dead. Ronnie Gilbert was still alive, and I tried to interview her, but she was no longer interviewable. I did interview pretty much all of those people because 20 years ago I was doing the research for a biography of Josh White. So I went pretty deep into that world. Yeah, I mean, I talked to pretty much all the Almanac Singers who were still alive at that point. But not specifically about this.
Two more questions?
I'm allowed 2 more questions. You're one of them, and you're the other.
You talked about imitating and trading, but I mean, was some of it just stealing? I mean, did some were they just taking like tunes and riffs and from each other? Was that okay or not frowned upon?
The answer to that is extremely variable. If I had to generalize, I would say that when somebody imitates you and doesn't do as well as you, they are simply paying homage and imitating. And when somebody imitates you and does better than you, they are stealing. But you don't tend to know till you see how they do. I mean, the white singers who covered Maybelline were just imitating Chuck Berry because nobody gave a damn. The white singers who covered Laverne Baker were stealing because they got the top 40 hits and she didn't. I mean, it's retrospect. There's often the saying, mediocre composers imitate, great composers steal. And that's sort of what we mean. I mean, once Beethoven does it, they forget that you did it. And then you feel like it's been stolen. But, I mean, it's complicated because, that whole discourse is about power. It isn't about one person playing what someone else plays. It's about someone with power playing something that someone without power plays and using that power to get credit that the other person might have got. But the process of imitation need not be any different from, in the one case, from the other. Is my answer. I'm sure there are others.
I'd love to hear you say something about Robert Plant.
I have nothing to say about Robert Plant. No, seriously, I have nothing to say about Robert Plant, so I can take one more question because I ducked that one. Yes.
Your book is also a lot about Pete.
My book is very much a lot
Very much
about Pete.
And I thought it was amazing the way you said it's a complex relationship, but you really set them up as very different paths. For Pete, very political, his music. It came out of a certain place in a critique. And Dylan really was, going his own way at this point in this artist vein. And that seemingly was,
Yeah. The thing, first of all, I made Pete the center of this book because, for 2 reasons. One is I wanted to, for people who weren't around then, really give them a sense of what the folk scene pre-Dylan looked like. And if one person ever exemplified a scene, it's Pete Seeger and the folk scene of the 1950s in every aspect. I mean, the amazing thing about Pete Seeger is he had the most popular pop folk group. He did the most rooted traditional music. Pete Seeger from 1954 through 1960 released an average 8 albums a year. He simply was folk music. I don't care what branch of folk music. It all came out of Pete Seeger, which made him just this wonderful way that you could exemplify a world. But I'd like to say, the other thing I wanted to say is that this thing is talked about as if Dylan is this complicated character, and Pete Seeger is just Pete. There was no one on earth more complicated than Pete Seeger. And so part of what I was trying to suggest in this was that these were two very complicated, very bright, very interesting people who at this one moment went head to head and represented opposite camps. But it's just this one moment. I mean, they remained in touch till Pete died. They had been very close before. They both understood that they were on different missions, and they both understood that the other was the best at doing that. I mean, you find Dylan in the 80s, 90s, whatever, saying, what Pete does, he's like a shaman. He has this magical way of bringing people together, and rock stars don't do that. We're just sort of living out people's fantasies. And you find Pete saying, I didn't get it at Newport, but pop music was changing into something different from what I thought pop music was, and Dylan was instrumental in that change. So, I was just trying to make this story, let's just say, more interesting. And now I'm going to go out front and I'm going to sign some books if anyone wants them signed. And I'm happy to answer more questions. I mean, I'm not going to have tape over my mouth or anything. Thank you very, very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.